Good afternoon. I wanted to share some from this book, Disabuse: How to Prevent, Detect, Investigate, and Eliminate Abuse in Churches and Faith-Based Organizations by Randall Rouser and Bob Stenhouse. So firstly, I want to just clarify the meaning of the word disabuse, because it sounds like it is somehow to unabuse somebody, and there's no such thing as unabuse. There's an adjective, unabused, but there's no verb that means to basically undo abuse. But there is disabuse, which means to persuade someone that an idea or a belief is mistaken. To free is a transitive verb, to free from mistake, fallacy, or deception. And as I put in the earlier slides, a little bit of etymology of this word disabuse. It comes from French, and in Old French, abuser meant to deceive, to misuse or to deceive. So to disabuse would be to reverse deception. I would say that in this book, definitely the title has a double entendre, because it is addressing physical, sexual, emotional, spiritual abuse in the church. But the only way that those types of abuses go on is because that original meaning of abuser, to abuse, being to deceive, that is also going on, deception. And unfortunately, a lot of people think, well, I'm not hitting anyone, I'm not abusing anyone. But abuse is much broader than physical abuse, and it only exists, especially in church communities, because there is deceit. And the only way we can address abuse in the church is to disabuse members of teachings and doctrines that disable them from holding leaders accountable. The only way to address abuse is to be disabused of teachings such as leaders you just cover, or love covers, meaning we don't talk about sins, we don't address abuse going on, we don't get involved, we don't air our dirty laundry. These types of concepts, beliefs that then allow for abuse to destroy human beings and families and institutions. Beliefs that allow predators, including leaders in churches, to ravage God's flock, to mistreat God's people. People have to be freed from these types of beliefs, to be disabused of such beliefs in order to then address abuse in church communities. So one point that this book makes about abuse is that abuse is not always something that is sensational. It's not always shocking actions. It's not always sexual, violent acts. Abuse does not always grab your attention. Abuse is also inaction. Banal, mediocre, totally uninventive complicity, silent complicity of observers who witness much but do nothing. This harms and abuses the flock also, the inaction. And I was reminded of the verses in Matthew 25. He will say to those on his left, this is verse 41 through 46, He will say to those on his left, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." They will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick or in prison and did not help you?" And he will reply, "Truly, I tell you, whatever you did not do for the least of these, for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Then they will go to eternal punishment, but the righteous to eternal life. So not doing something for someone who needs something is also damnable in God's eyes. And yes, some may say, well, this is to the unbelievers. Okay, but what about the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, where the Good Samaritan came to the man that was wounded, saw him, took pity on him, went to him, bandaged his wounds, poured in oil and wine, put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn and took care of him. And then he took out money to give to the innkeeper, saying, "Look after him, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." And then it says, "Go and do likewise." Jesus tells this lawyer, go and do that. So to not do that, to be that Levite, to be that priest who walks by, is a form of abuse to that man, and not doing what the Lord tells us to do to one another is mistreating one another. And, I right now, I hate to even say this. People say I throw my kids under the bus. Well, I'm sorry you feel that way. But my son is sick, and he's in the hospital. And yesterday I saw some full-timers who sovereignly meet. These full-timers are like in the church community that I used to meet with. They're people who are paid to do campus outreach and serve in the church. And I, by God's sovereignty, work in the same building as they meet. And so I was walking to work to teach online, and saw two really, really dear full-timers who I've known for a lot of years. One of them, since before she was born, I hosted her baby shower. And she now serves full-time. And they apologized for parking in my parking spot for the office. I said, no problem. Nathan just needed it one time and, went in to ask someone to move their car. But I said, but he's in the hospital. And it was like all we could talk about were our dogs. Two of us have a dog, and Riley was there, my dog. And we talked about my former dog, Buddy, and we talked about the sister's dog. And then, the older of the two, who's only around 30, she said, I'm sorry, Nathan's in the hospital. How is he? And I said, none of us are doing well. We're hanging by a thread. And it's like they just kept smiling, nodding, and then went to their coordination. And I love these sisters. I'm not speaking against them. I'm speaking against a system that doesn't allow believers to actually address the real problems, because they know if they address Nathan's real situation, they're also going to have to face the fact that I'm speaking out about Philip Lee sexually assaulting me. It's like, you got to stay away from Ruth because she speaks evilly. No, I'm speaking out to disabuse members of the flock who have been misled and who have been deceived by people in, quote, the local church / the Lord's Recovery / the Living Stream ministry. And that is something you just are not allowed to do in that system. So I'll just read some of the words, sentences, paragraphs in this book that I underlined. When abuse arises, the church often either fails to investigate altogether, or it ends up botching the investigation and thereby compounding the problem. So when I was 16 years old and I went to Taipei and I was inappropriately and against my will touched in private areas by Philip Lee, was there an investigation? I think the situation is that there was a failure to investigate altogether, because I was never counseled. I was never asked anything. I internalized it for over 30 years. So first, assess, did it happen? And second, if it did happen, does it qualify as abuse? If the answer to both of these questions is yes, you have a founded allegation. Did it happen? And if it happened, does it qualify as abuse according to the law? If so, then there should be the steps taken righteously, legally, properly. Here's another sentence. I was particularly disturbed by the way psychopaths often flourish within church settings by exploiting well-meaning but credulous people and theologies of grace and forgiveness. So a big part of believers' problems can be due to the fact that those who are honest and well-meaning and even pure, to the extent that we're pure, can also be very credulous, which means having or showing too great a readiness to believe things. And unfortunately, if the leaders are deceptive, they are very easily believed by credulous people. If the leaders teach you not to listen to anything negative, and you're a credulous person, and you believe that hearing anything negative is taking in death, then there's no way for those who are being abused to get help in such a system by those who are credulous, who have such a great readiness to believe their leaders. So what I've shared so far was from an introduction and a foreword. The first chapter is called Naming the Abuse, and it describes somebody who had unwittingly been formed into patterns of systemic abuse and led to think that being exploited is just what it means to have the opportunity to serve others and contribute to God's kingdom. If mistreatment or abuse has been normalized, if you've come to believe it is acceptable conduct, it becomes that much more difficult to identify it, let alone to prevent it. For that reason, the starting point for any attempt to prevent, detect, investigate, or eliminate abuse comes with the naming of abuse. While there are many types of abuse, 6 are the most common: harassment, bullying, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, discrimination, and spiritual abuse. So let's go first to harassment. Harassment, by the definition of the government of British Columbia, where this book was written, is any inappropriate conduct or comment that a person knew or reasonably ought to have known would be humiliating or intimidating. Any action, conduct, or comment, any action or word that a person knew or reasonably ought to have known would be humiliating or intimidating is harassment. So ought to know or ought to have known requires a reasonable person type test. A reasonable person test concerns whether a reasonable person would find the comment or conduct in question to meet the threshold of abuse, in this case of harassment. Ask, would a reasonable person find this person's sequence of conduct and comment while interacting with another person humiliating or intimidating? If they would, then that pastor has engaged in harassment. Okay, because it gave a scenario. A withering glare from an authority figure can be intimidating and is usually meant to be, and this can be a form of harassment. A scolding tone, mocking. So as you reflect on this, it says, ask yourself whether you have ever been harassed in a church-based setting. Have you been subjected to inappropriate conduct or comment that a reasonable person would know to be humiliating or intimidating? Have you ever been harassed by a church leader? I would just like to ask, have you ever been harassed by a church leader? Or have you witnessed someone being harassed, someone being humiliated or intimidated by a church leader? If yes, then your church culture is likely abusive, and you need to be disabused of believing that you have to remain in that type of setting and not speak up. Okay, so bullying. Bullying involves repeated incidents or a pattern of behavior that is intended to intimidate, offend, degrade, or humiliate. Acts or verbal comments that could psychologically or mentally hurt or isolate a person. Hurt or isolate a person. It has also been described as the assertion of power through aggression. The target in bullying may be a group rather than an individual, like it can be women. It can be a subgroup of the population. Okay, sexual harassment. Any inappropriate conduct or comment of a sexual nature that a person knew or reasonably ought to have known would be humiliating or intimidating. Unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, other verbal or physical harassment of a sexual nature in an environment. It does not always have to be specifically about sexual behavior or directed at a specific person. For example, negative comments about women as a group may be a form of sexual harassment. What matters is how a reasonable person would interpret the conduct, irrespective of the individual's professed intent. Like, I didn't mean it that way. Well, would a reasonable person have interpreted it that way, irrespective of your intent? The point is simple. If a person doesn't want to be touched, do not touch them. Keep in mind, you need consent to touch people. Make space for one another. Accommodate boundaries and comfort. Church communities formed by purity culture are at an increased risk of sexual harassment. Purity culture can teach that women are responsible to not turn on a male figure. The purity culture can teach that if you dress in a certain way, you're basically lying to men, telling them that they can have your body when they actually can't, defrauding them. So sexual abuse is the unwanting touching of a sexual nature. Sexual harassment is at the lower end of sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is a spectrum, with harassment being at the lower end, unwanted touching in the middle of the spectrum, and then assault at the high end. Often we sugarcoat behaviors, calling misconduct or abuse inappropriate. But the truth is that description tells us nothing about the alleged behavior. Burping can be labeled as inappropriate, in certain instances, but sexual harassment, sexual assault, these are not inappropriate behaviors. These are illegal behaviors. Instead of saying Pastor Jim resigned due to inappropriate behavior, a church shouldn't whitewash that. They should say Pastor Jim was terminated from his position due to sexual harassment of a legal minor. Hi again. It's now hours later. I went to a service at Shepherd Church and took a nice drive with a friend, took a walk, etc. But I wanted to finish this video tonight, so I'm going to do my best. I ended with talking about sexual abuse, but I actually have more to share on that. So when some people are assaulted, they can be blamed for not saying anything or not doing anything to stop the assault. Often there's the saying used, it takes two to tango. Critics justify their assessment by pointing out that the victim never stopped the offender's advances. Why didn't she say no? These authors talk about tonic immobility, which was the first time I've heard of that. It includes the freeze response to trauma as well as the fawn response to trauma. So one may play dead, or in the fawning response, one may become compliant with the wishes of a perpetrator, and both freezing and fawning can be mistaken for consent. So here's to disabuse listeners. That is not consent. It's what the body and even the mind and soul can do to survive trauma. So tonic immobility is measured on a scale ranging from detachment from self on the low level to paralysis on the higher level. Those who experience a lower level tonic immobility response may describe themselves as going along with it or going through the motions, or having a feeling that they were there but not there, or that they were observing rather than participating in whatever occurred. At the higher level, a person may experience paralysis, lose consciousness, and black out. The unifying theme within tonic immobility responses is that the person withdraws into compliance or inaction as a defense response. So never dismiss allegations with trite phrases like it takes two to tango, or loaded questions like, why didn't you say no? Always look for the evidence of a power disparity, possible spiritual abuse, and signs of a tonic immobility response to trauma. They talk about the elements of consent, that elements of coercion, brainwashing, gaslighting, and even spiritualizing of a relationship can cause confusion and deepen trauma when there is sexual abuse. There is not the option of free consent when a person lacks power relative to their perpetrator. Indirect phrases should be considered non-consent, such as, I don't know about this. This seems wrong. Are you sure? I'm not comfortable. Can we think about this? Wait. This is awkward, I put in, because those are the words I used. And giggling should not be translated as consent, because it is often also a trauma response. It can be evidence of tonic immobility and the absence of consent. You must have clear and credible verbalization of consent. And remember, this should be from a non-minor. Okay, discrimination. In the context of workplace investigations, the term refers to the practice of making unjustified prejudicial distinctions in comment or conduct which serve to disempower or marginalize a class or a group of people on human rights protected grounds. The experience of discrimination can have a devastating impact, leading to stress, anxiety, anger, and depression. Okay, now spiritual abuse. So what exactly is spiritual abuse? On one popular view, spiritual abuse is a type of abuse distinct from the others being defined in terms of the misuse of spiritual authority and power by a leader within a religious community. Any leader who uses his authority in a way that controls and hurts others is likely a perpetrator of spiritual abuse. But we do not think it is limited merely to those in a position of spiritual authority. There are people who misuse informal power and engage in spiritual abuse, such as a pastor's son may possess power by virtue of being the pastor's son or grandson, or co-worker's son or grandson or daughter. A congregant may possess power in virtue of being known to be the wealthiest and most generous donor in the church. A person may possess power in the annual church meeting in virtue of a bold and assertive personality. A person may possess power due to a fearless and unshakable belief that God has revealed his divine will to them in some unique way. A self-identified prophet may possess power with their confidence and encyclopedic memory of selected scriptures that shuts down any dissent or attempts at alternative interpretation. So spiritual abuse is defined as the abusive exercise of coercive power and control in a spiritual context, often in a manner that humiliates, demoralizes, and or terrorizes another person. And such emotional abuse is a type of spiritual abuse when it is in a spiritual or religious setting. We believe it makes sense to recognize spiritual abuse as a unique harm which marshals the protean power of spiritual commitment and authority, often in a way that inflicts great harm on others. So I have one last section to cover, and that is 3 types of abusers. That section goes into narcissists, psychopaths, and groomers. The second a narcissist perceives you as failing to provide them with the attention and adulation they crave, their sense of personal aggrievement can turn on you, creating a whiplash effect that can be devastating. Failure to bend the knee or kiss the ring of the narcissistic pastor or leader will often result in a bullying campaign to eliminate those unwilling to extend blind loyalty and feasance. Their fleeting alliances, constant need for validation, and demand for the attention of others can soon become exhausting and begin to drain the energy and health of a church. Church leadership positions may have an allure because they offer relative distinction and social prestige. In many Christian traditions, people view the clergy member as having a special authority and moral distinction, as one who has received a special calling to ministry that is not extended to others. This may be viewed as imbuing the pastor with unique authority and prestige that can feed into a narcissistic mindset. Okay, then psychopaths have several traits, including superficiality, grandiosity, deceitfulness, a lack of remorse and empathy, and impulsivity. But probably the most defining characteristic of a psychopath is amorality. In other words, psychopaths lack a moral compass, an experiential grasp of right and wrong, good and evil. It's like they're colorblind to moral values. So this really struck a chord with me, because in the Lord's Recovery, you are taught that we should not be on the tree of knowledge of good and evil, but just on the tree of life. And there is a despising and a teaching to avoid distinguishing between right and wrong, good and evil, saying that that's all on the tree that leads to death. Psychopaths tend to see any social exchange as a feeding opportunity, a contest, or a test of wills in which there can only be one winner. Their motives are to manipulate, take ruthlessly, and without remorse. Together, the pieces of the puzzle form an image of a self-centered, callous, remorseless person, profoundly lacking in empathy, and the ability to form warm emotional relationships with others, a person who functions without the constraints of conscience. Many psychopaths gravitate to positions of power and authority. Psychopaths are attracted to power and money the way sharks are attracted to chum. And then groomers. So groomers identify a target, gain the target's trust, isolate the target, sexualize the relationship, maintain control. But in there is also, they also often groom the family of the target. Anyway, all of these individuals that are types of abusers are malevolent master manipulators. They capitalize on the weakness of others, use intimidation and violence to avoid detection, and live the life of a lie. So this is Bob Stenhouse writing. I observed and interacted with several fawning and naive followers of a charismatic yet deeply flawed leader who manipulated and deceived many. They, being the followers, they either could not conceive the possibility of the leader they revered as being a master manipulator, or their blind loyalty and love was an unhealthy, codependent dynamic leading to a closed mind related to their holiness and calling and attacking anyone who would dare claim otherwise. Confronting the abuser and the Darvo response. So these types of abusers listed here, these narcissists, psychopaths, groomers, master manipulators, when you confront them, they will typically use Darvo, which I've learned through this YouTube channel. They will deny and attack and then reverse the victim and offender roles. They will consider that anyone speaking the truth, to confront them with the truth of their abuse, is attacking them. And so please note on my channel, when people say, why are you attacking the church? If I am speaking the truth about sins and confronting sins, that is not attacking anyone. Such abusers deny legitimate allegations, attack the individual making the complaint, and seek to turn the tables by claiming that it is, in fact, the complainant who is the problem. So please note that denying something does not make you somebody that is an abuser practicing Darvo, because innocent people also can deny allegations. But if the denial is more indignant, self-righteous, and manipulative, and it is followed with reversing of victim and offender role and accusation of the other. Anyway, it takes discernment to know, but here it says the bottom line is, if you are really dealing with a malevolent master manipulator, you need to prepare for and anticipate this kind of hostile bullying response. Expect the abuser to attempt to flip the script by recasting you as the problem. Be ready for counter allegations and threats. Remain calm and do not lose heart. Retain all your evidence and allow it to speak for itself. So I want to just briefly give the example of Witness Lee and the Living Stream Ministry with several of the brothers who were co-workers with Witness Lee and are now blended brothers, giving testimony against brothers who confronted Witness Lee about his son's sexual immorality and coercive control. So this was a very classic Darvo move, the Fermentation of the Present Rebellion published book, where there is denial of the claims, well, not even mentioning of claims related to Philip Lee, which was a main issue, but denial of some things like where is their control, accusation, and then reversal of victim and the offender in that book. Those brothers, they didn't attack. They approached a leader of a movement or of a Christian group with very definite concerns. Those are not attacks, but those concerns were denied or ignored. And those brothers were attacked, were called rebellious, were accused of fermenting rebellion, of conspiring, and Witness Lee was framed as the victim of their attacks. What attacks? And the same thing has happened with Ron Kangas toward Stephen Isett. Ron has never met with Steve once, not talked with him once, and yet has publicly called him all kinds of things: the man of death, someone who lies, evil man on the internet, etc. Steve never attacked. He never reviled Ron. Ron has reviled him. There's a reverse of victim and offender. There's denial, there's accusing and attacking, and reversal of victim and offender in so many cases. If there's Darvo being practiced by a leader or a group of leaders, it's probably not healthy leadership, because healthy leaders look like David, who, when Nathan came to him to rebuke him, he repented. He didn't deny. And David's sin in taking the wife of Uriah, taking Bathsheba, had consequences, serious consequences, and was still recorded in the New Testament, in the genealogy of Jesus. So David didn't deny it. He repented, and that's what healthy leaders do. So there's so much more I'd like to say, but I am tired, and I'm going to go visit Nathan in the morning, and so I hope that this video is helpful. Take care.